There we have an image of the New Forest without any cars in it, and with lovely purple heather for the tourists, and demonized bracken there, and an incredible mix, not a pastoral landscape where you've got the grass, you've got the heather, you've got the bracken, you've got the gorse, and little groves of holly, and they're all intermixing. And the blurb that we have for this conference emphasizes that this landscape has been described as unique in Northwest Europe, and I'm not going to knock that. And if we look at this, you can see the images of, you see the outline there of the hard grazed scrub, and you've got grassland and scrub and moving up to woodland in the distance. But I think you need a double take on this, or perhaps some of you don't. If you look at the horse in the middle foreground there, you can see it's got a bell on it, and this image has been taken in the Basque country. But it's got echoes, I think, of what we have in the New Forest. And in fact, we do have a number of very large commons in Europe. The New Forest is top right there. Top left, we've got Transylvania, it's the Breite Reserve near Sighisoara in Romania. And the other two diagonals are from Navarra in the Basque country, where something like, I think it's about 50%, probably about 46% of the land is common land. And all of these have got these complex mixtures of the different habitats in constant flux. And also often these huge trees, veteran trees, which you can see for many of them that they have been worked. These are pollards, but you also get shrouds or shreds where the limbs have been lopped off from the main trunk. And these are cultural landscapes. They have a shared cultural and natural heritage, and that is the very foundation of their core being, the very foundation of their identity. If we look now at the distribution of royal forests in England and Wales, this is after Langton and Jones. Now, the New Forest was one of the earliest forests established. It's very difficult to know what the correct term should be, because I think I'm correct in saying that none of the forests were designated or declared. They're just suddenly there. You see in the records, they're suddenly there. And the New Forest is one of the earliest ones we hear about 25 present by the time of Doomsday, 1086, and many others established later that century and in the subsequent century or so. Very uneven distribution. You can see, perhaps what is clearest is that you've got large areas where there are no forests. The area of the Seven Vales stretching up into the up towards Lincolnshire. You've got Suffolk, East Anglia, very few royal forests there. Even in Kent, southeast England, very few forests. And there are different estimates for these, but the conclusion is they may have covered, at their greatest, between about a quarter and a third of England and Wales. So a forest, by its definition, by its very definition, was an area governed by a particular type of law, which was forest law. And this had the king and the king's interests at its centre. And forest law was imported as a fully established system by the Normans, and it's got the complex judiciary with its sort of ritualistic arrangement and names which have echoes to today. And it was originally focused on the king's own land, but there was a massive expansion of this in the 12th century to include the people's land. And of course, it included a wide range of habitats, not woodlands in the modern sense, not closed canopy in the wooden sense, but open and park-like landscapes, commons, and even an area of arable. And this presents us with a particular problem, because there were, depending on whether you're a lumper or a splitter, there could have been about 900 forests in England and Wales, and these are too extensive to hunt or even visit in a king's lifetime. So what on earth were they for? And we shouldn't kid ourselves that the forests were just about hunting, or in some cases even mainly about hunting. And the fact is that the forests could generate about half of royal income, and this was particularly important in the days before taxation. The king could demand payments for any sort of agricultural activity, any enclosure, any felling, and even through adjustment for pasturing. Now, the forests, by and large, were hated by the upper echelons of society, or perhaps not those closest to the king, but those just below that, because it curtailed their freedoms, it subdued their authority, reduced their income. There could be the imposition of massive fines with the threat of maiming or execution. And yet the commoners, by and large, enjoyed a stronger level of protection within the forests, while they were still forests, than in manorial land. This is the distribution. I don't know whether you can pick that up in this light, but that is the distribution of the forests that we had earlier. It looks a bit faint from here. If we now superimpose where the surviving commons of England are, there is a very close link. It's a very strong, but it's an imperfect link between surviving commons and where the forests were. Some commons, of course, have descended directly from the forest era, including the one we're in. But correlation, of course, is not causation, and geology, land tenure, and a wide range of other things have had their play as to whether sites have survived or not. Now, I may have a different take on this to Richard, but I'm going to stick to my guns. The Carta de Foresta was drafted more or less alongside the Magna Carta, and it was first issued in 1217, and it was reissued over on a number of other occasions through the subsequent century. And the 1225 version emphasises that where the king afforests his own land, that means brings it within forest law, he must not interfere with common rights of any man who had a right before. So even the king was quite limited as to what he could do in a forest. And commons and common rights are, of course, often older than the royal forests. I'm going to look now at some of the characteristics of the royal forests, because there are four key characteristics of the royal forests throughout the country. Extensive lands in the hands of the king, certainly the case around here. Poor soils for agriculture. Now, by and large, if the soils were any good, that land would be divvied out to the nobles as manorial land, be run under the manorial system, probably in exchange for providing a service like military service, which was the key one. And that meant that the king had the runt, as it were, of the land left in his own hands. And by and large, that is the origin of the forests. Forests also, of course, good for deer, boar, and game. Fallow deer certainly introduced, or certainly brought over by the Romans. There's clear archaeological evidence of fallow deer having been raised in this country, but they probably never established as a wild animal, but the Normans certainly brought them over and they became fairly commonplace. Wild boar probably rarely come into our era. Boar were by and large wiped out pretty early in medieval times. Another key characteristic, links with castles or with royal residences. And the forest provided the castles with timber for construction. We often hear about castles and about forests almost in the same breath. In exactly the same document that you hear that a castle is being built or has been built, there is mention of a forest nearby. It's the first ever mention. So we have timber for construction, we have fuel. Sorry, I'm not always getting a response from this. They provided meat for the table and recreational hunting. Also a mark on the landscape, a mark of prestige. And collectively, they generated a huge amount of royal income, and the castles provided the enforcement mechanism often necessary, the protection and the jails. So there's a close link between them. I'm going to look now at this particular site, which is Great Wishford, just north of Salisbury, so not far away. In some cases, you had to assert your common rights in order to hold on to them. And on Oak Apple Day every year, the residents of Great Wishford get up and make a lot of noise before dawn, banging dustbin lids together and saucepans and things like that, beckoning everybody to get up into Groveley Wood, or Groveley Forest, and to collect their green oak boughs. And then these are used to decorate the village and the church. You can see there's one hanging at the top of the tower there. There's one on the inside, which is used through the year to bless newlyweds. And sticks from these are gathered into small bundles called niches, which is like a small faggot. And then the villagers take their green boughs to Salisbury Cathedral, where they do a fairly weird dance in the cathedral close. And then they go into the cathedral, they read from their charter, which gives them the right to collect these green boughs, and then they give a yell, and it is a real yell. It is worth going to see this dance and hear the sort of pagan nature of all this. They yell, "Groveley, Groveley, and all Groveley." You won't be surprised to hear they don't give a stuff for their green oak boughs on any other day of the year. Now, there are records of the custom which certainly go back to the 1500s, and these records show that these are legal rights. So we're not talking about a grant or a privilege. These are rights. The Charter emphasises that they are rights, they've ever been rights, and they ought to be rights. So those are going to be rights. But they're already of considerable antiquity, because by 1597, they're described as old, ancient customs, time out of mind. But the dance, at least in its current location, it cannot predate the building of Salisbury Cathedral, which was 1220. And Groveley is interesting because it's another one of these handful of sites which is established as a royal hunting forest by the time of Doomsday. Well, continuity, and that's continuity of management and continuity of habitat, is a major factor governing biodiversity. And all the evidence that we have points to strong links between common land and biodiversity. And that includes the wood pasture, which we heard about earlier, and the veteran trees, which I mentioned just now, where they still exist. So where do common rights come from? Well, they can come from express grant, but by and large, they have originated spontaneously, by and large. So we've got to think of a shared resource used by a community. Here it's Estovers. They're taking small wood for fuel and ploughs and repairs. And then through custom and practice, that becomes recognised as an entitlement. And it's the concept of a defendable right, defendable in law. And manorial and forest courts would uphold those local customs. In due course, there would be a sort of harmonisation of such rights through common law. But all of this has gone on completely independently from the law, through acts of parliament and through the legislative assembly. So the key issue here is that custom and practice is not the basis of law. It is the law. So long-standing practices have become codified and protected as rights, and they have the full protection of the law. Now, there's been massive rethinking in ecological and wider circles in recent years about whether Europe was ever really covered in closed canopy woodland. We've been told this since we were at school, that woodland was once cloaked in woodland. Britain was once cloaked in woodland, and then Neolithic man came along and chopped it all down. And this man in particular, Franz Vera, has very seriously questioned whether there is any evidence for that. It's just an assumption. And that the norm was this open wood pasture, like we still have today in the New Forest. And that was really extensive throughout Europe. Of course, we get the closed canopy woodland within enclosures, within fenced enclosures, but these are essentially modern. And wood pasture, with its ebb and flow of all these different habitats that Clive spoke about and we've seen on the slides, is absolutely characteristic of these commons and characteristic of the royal forests. There's quite an interesting experiment that's gone on at Knepp, which is in Knepp Castle, which is in Sussex recently, where land has been abandoned and effectively allowed to run wild. I cannot use the word rewilding because it's stupid and it sticks in the throat about there. But it's certainly been allowed to run wild. And it's produced startling results. Sightings of 300 purple emperors on one day. Now that's got to be a national record. And other species like turtle doves, nightingales, which are both red-listed species, high numbers of those. And perhaps this is showing the value of habitats in flux. Where you have most SSSIs, they're going to be quite small, so you want to hold onto their habitats, not allow them to change. But in a place like this, it's in transition, and a lot of things are coming in. And you've even got there oak, which is establishing itself naturally in a protection of thorn. Some of you will be familiar with the expression, supposedly from the New Forest, that the thorn is the mother of the oak. It can form a natural barrier, like a natural barbed wire, which animals can't get through, and then oak will come up and be protected in the centre of it. And it's happening at Knepp. Well, I'm going to meet this head on. Is the New Forest overgrazed? Depends what you mean by overgrazed. But is the new forest overgrazed? Yes, definitely. In some places, and it's undergrazed in others, and it doesn't really matter, because that's part of its interest. Some areas are hard grazed, some areas are less grazed, and they're all intermingling and moving around through the years or through the centuries. Now, it would be true to say that forest commons are resilient. We shouldn't think of them as stable, but they're certainly resilient. And changes have occurred, especially to things like tree cover. And that's often tied to the number of animals there. And such changes can be sudden, or they can be incremental. And there's a couple of records here from Savernake. This is just one record. The thing about Savernake, which is in Wiltshire, it's particularly valuable because it's been in the hands of a single family since the 11th century. And the number of records which have survived from there are remarkable. But there's a record here of 33,000 trees being felled at times of political and military tension for working on castles at Marlborough, Newbury and Caversham in the 1200s. So that would have had a catastrophic sudden change. And then we've got incremental change where we've got adjustment records of 11,000 animals. At a time when you could graze, for the summer, for the year, you could graze 10 sheep for a penny. But the impact of all these animals in an area would have prevented regeneration and caused a gradual decline in tree cover. So in Savernake in particular, by Tudor times, we hear that much woodland has been converted to pasture. Now, I'm just sort of pulling it together now. We must recognise the cultural origins of these places as commons and as royal forests. And it's part of their interest. These are cultural landscapes. And we must value expertise in this process. So we need to give local communities a say, perhaps the dominant say, in management, and ensuring a bottom-up approach rather than imposing a solution from authority figures like Clive. But we do have a bit of a dilemma because we do need national and international recognition to get the money. So that's going to release the money, but we need to ensure that site management and pride is not taken away from local people. So in conclusion, 900 royal forests were established, covering, say, a quarter, maybe a third of England and Wales, and they imposed stringent laws, but by and large protected the commons. The royal forests were, and are here, still cultural landscapes, been shaped by pastoral commoning, and that was a right. It's not a privilege, it's not a grant, it's a right. Commons are ancient institutions. They've got their roots in very early history and prehistory. We could debate that, but it's quite possible that they go back to the Bronze Age or maybe earlier, as a notion anyway, and they predate the royal forests. This long continuity of habitats gives resilience and enhances the biodiversity. But as unenclosed landscapes, they are in constant flux. And we need to recognise the international importance, but not forget local communities and keep them at the heart of conservation. Thank you.